morning of November 3rd, 1971, Youngstown, Ohio, Sheriff Ray Higgins stood at the gate of an old wooden house on Gagarin Street. The search had just ended. It was just a house, a sagging fence, a roof patched with tar paper, laundry still hanging on a line in the yard, stiffening in the cold. A typical Youngstown house, one of thousands clinging to the gray hills. In his left hand, Higgins pinched a Camel cigarette. In his right, a thin, cheap, spiral-bound notebook. It was the kind you'd buy for a dime at the corner store. On the cover was a faded picture of a puppy, and inside, between a recipe for a honey-kissed apple pie and a note honey, 1 cup, flour, 3 cups, was something that made the 46-year-old veteran's fingers go cold, colder than they'd been in the Ardennes forest. 4 men's names were written in a neat, careful script. Beside each, a date. Higgins read the names again, the first, the second, the third, the fourth. All 4 of them were dead. All 4 had died within the last 6 months. All 4 after attending a wake, and at every single one of those wakes, sitting on the table, was a golden, sticky, honey-kissed apple pie, baked by the owner of this house, a quiet, rail-thin woman of 34 named Faith Nelson. Higgins took a long drag from his Camel and stared at the curtained windows. Behind them was silence, an empty, ringing silence. The woman who lived here had been driven away 10 minutes ago in a locked sheriff's car, quiet, unassuming, helpful Faith. He looked at the notebook one last time. 4 names, 4 dates, 4 deaths, and the tidy, almost childish handwriting of a woman who baked the best damn apple pie in the whole county. To understand how a dishwasher from the steel mill cafeteria ended up at the center of a story that would be whispered about all over Ohio, you have to go back 3 years to 1968, to the day Faith Nelson's life cracked clean in 2. If you like stories where every word is true and every detail sends a shiver down your spine, you've come to the right place. Stay with us. Youngstown, Ohio, at the tail end of the 60s. A city growing faster than it could keep its own promises. On the south side of the Mahoning River, new housing tracts were rising rows of identical ranch houses and wide, optimistic streets. The radio played Creedence Clearwater Revival. The downtown cinema was showing Times The Graduate Asterisk. But this part of town, the north side, was a different Youngstown, a place of wood and pre-war grit. Here, the streets weren't paved. After it rained, the mud would suck at your boots. The houses were clapboard, heated by coal furnaces, with outhouses in the back. Water came from a pump on the corner. In winter, the pipes would freeze, and old women in thick headscarves would haul buckets 300 yards through the snow. In summer, the dust from the dirt roads coated everything, and kids played stickball with a crushed tin can because a real ball was a luxury. This was a working-class neighborhood. The men worked at the mills, U.S. Steel, Youngstown Sheet and Tube. The women worked in cafeterias, laundries, or at the Packard Electric plant. The salary was $120 a week, $160 if you were lucky enough to be a foreman. They lived crammed together. You could see everything through the slatboard fences. Neighbors knew it all. Who drank, who hit his wife, who was fooling around, who was in debt, who was about to get laid off. There were no secrets. Or so it seemed. In this neighborhood, at 14 Gagarin Street, lived the Nelson family. Ethan Nelson, 31, a hydraulic press operator, 3rd class, at Youngstown Sheet and Tube. He was strong, quiet, and hard-working. A rarity in the neighborhood. He didn't drink, didn't smoke either. On Sundays, he went to the small Baptist church down the street, even though it wasn't fashionable in those days. He spoke little and did much. The neighbors respected him. A solid man, they'd say. Not many of those left. Faith Nelson, 31, Ethan's wife. She was born in a tiny town in rural West Virginia, 100 miles from anywhere. Her mother died when Faith was 9. Her father, a disabled coal miner who'd lost his right arm in a cave-in, drank his sorrow. Faith grew up alone. She learned to cook at 7 because no one else would. She learned to be silent even earlier because when her father drank, he didn't like noise. At 19, she married Ethan. He'd driven down to her town for a distant relative's funeral and saw her at the graveside, a skinny girl in a black shawl with her eyes cast down. 2 months later, he was courting her, and 4 months after that, they were married. She moved to Youngstown. They were poor, but their life was steady. Ethan worked. Faith kept house. They had no children. Faith had seen doctors at the county hospital, but with no results. Ethan never blamed her. God will provide. When the time is right, he'd say. Faith remained silent and baked. She baked a lot. For Ethan, she made biscuits and gravy, pot roast. For the neighbors, if someone asked, or for a wake, she made her honey-kissed apple pie. Faith's apple pie was special. She'd brought the recipe from her grandmother in West Virginia. The crust was flaky, paper-thin. The apples were golden, and the honey was real, not the store-bought kind. Faith would buy it from a beekeeper out in Amish country. She made a special trip for it. The syrup was thick, gooey, soaking into every slice. When Faith brought her pie to a wake or a potluck, people would go quiet, not just because it was delicious, but because it tasted real. It was the kind of pie their grandmothers used to make, a taste most people in the city had forgotten. Faith started getting asked to bring her pie to every wake, to weddings, if they could afford to ask, to send-offs for boys going to Vietnam, to anniversaries. She would arrive, set the pie on the table, offer a small smile from the corner of her mouth, and retreat to a corner. She'd sit quietly, not drinking, not dancing, not talking unless spoken to. Then she would leave just as quietly. The neighbors would say, Faith is a saint. So quiet, so modest. And those hands of hers are pure gold. Ethan sure is a lucky man. Ethan's luck ran out on November 14th, 1968. That day, there was an accident at Youngstown Sheet and Tube. The hydraulic press in shop number 3, its safety lock system failed. Ethan Nelson had worked that press for 6 years. He knew it like the back of his hand, but that day, it didn't matter. The press came down while Ethan was changing a steel plate. He didn't have time to pull his hand back, and then he didn't have time to jump away. An ambulance was called 12 minutes later. It arrived in 40. Ethan was still alive for another 20 minutes after they pulled him out. He died in the back of that ambulance without ever regaining consciousness. He was 31 years old. Faith was told that evening. The shop foreman, a man named Paul Kuzman, 45, sweaty, pale, and wearing greasy overalls, came to her door. Faith, he said, his voice heavy. There's been an incident. Ethan, he got careless at the press. Faith didn't scream. She didn't cry or faint. She just stood in the doorway of her house at 14 Gagarin Street, wearing an apron dusted with flour, and looked at Kuzman with her dark, quiet eyes. Then she asked, "Where is he?" Kuzman told her, "The county morgue, out on the highway." Faith nodded, closed the door, and sat in her kitchen until morning without turning on a single light. They buried Ethan 2 days later. The neighbors came, and the guys from the mill, the pastor read from the Bible. Faith stood at the grave, straight and motionless. She didn't cry. The neighbor women whispered, "Poor thing. She's turned to stone with grief." Others said, "That's how those mountain folk cry on the inside, not for show." A third group just shook their heads. At the wake, Faith served the food herself: potato soup, fried chicken, green bean casserole, and her honey-kissed apple pie. The pie sat in the center of the table. Everyone ate, and everyone praised it, and everyone told Faith, "You be strong now, honey." She would nod, smile with the corner of her mouth, and stay silent. And then she started making the rounds. Faith wanted only one thing: justice, compensation for her husband's death on the job, a widow's pension, an admission of the company's guilt, The Accident Investigation Committee took 2 weeks. The report was written quickly. In the box labeled cause, they wrote, "Gross violation of safety procedures by the employee, E. Nelson." The translation was simple. It was his own damn fault. The shop foreman, Victor Labanov, 52, a company man and party loyalist, signed the report without even reading it. A month later, he was promoted to assistant director of a sister plant in Chicago. He left. Faith stayed. She went to the union. The union man said, "The report is filed. The committee did its work. The decision is made." She went to the company's HR department. The HR man said, "We offer our condolences, but the paperwork shows it was employee negligence." She went to the county administrator's office. They listened, wrote her name in a ledger, and said, "We'll look into it." They didn't. She wrote a letter to the Times Youngstown Vindicator *. It was never published. She wrote to the State Labor Board and got a reply. Following a review, no violations of labor law were found. She wrote to her congressman in Washington. A reply came 4 months later. A form letter. "Your inquiry has been forwarded to the appropriate authorities in the state of Ohio for their consideration." 2 years. For 2 years, Faith walked and wrote and pleaded and waited. For 2 years, she was told the same thing. Your husband was at fault. For 2 years, she would come home to 14 Gagarin Street, sit in her kitchen, and stare at the wall where a photograph of Ethan hung young in a white shirt at their wedding, and she would be silent. She didn't get louder. She didn't become a troublemaker, the kind of woman who yells at town hall meetings and demands the truth. She remained quiet. But inside that quiet, something changed. Something broke. Or maybe something clicked into place with a quiet, terrible finality. Faith got a job as a dishwasher in the cafeteria at Youngstown Sheet and Tube, the very same mill that had killed her husband. Every day, she would walk through the main gate, across the yard past shop number 3, where that same press stood, and go down into the basement cafeteria to wash dishes. The pay was $70 a week, peanuts, but it was enough for her. She lived alone, spent little, and bought flour, honey, butter. She baked her apple pie. The neighbors pitied her. Poor Faith, all alone now. She's still so young. She could get married again, but she doesn't want to. She's a loyal one, they said. Must have really loved her, Ethan. Faith truly did not want to remarry, but not just because she had loved Ethan. She looked at the men in her neighborhood and saw the same thing over and over. Drunk, useless, cruel men. Men who came home on payday with empty pockets because they'd drunk it all away. Men who beat their wives for burning the meatloaf. Men who slept on the front porch in a puddle of their own filth while their kids walked around in worn-out sneakers. Her Ethan had been different. He didn't drink. He worked hard. He dreamed of having a son. And he was dead. But these men lived. They lived and drank and hit and cheated. They skipped shifts, collected their paychecks, and spent them on cheap whiskey and cigarettes. And nothing touched them. No one punished them. No hydraulic press fell on them. Faith thought about this every evening, sitting in her kitchen, looking at Ethan's photograph. And one day, in the spring of 1971, she made a decision. A quiet decision. Just as quiet as she was. But first, the poison. Thallium. And why, in 1971, an ordinary woman could get her hands on a deadly poison as easily as a loaf of bread. Thallium, a heavy metal, looks a bit like lead. It has no color, no taste, no smell. Once in the body, it destroys the nervous system, the kidneys, the liver. A person grows weak, nauseous, they start vomiting. Then come convulsions, then a coma, then death. The process takes anywhere from 1 to 3 days, depending on the dose. Most importantly, the symptoms of thallium poisoning are almost indistinguishable from a heart attack or severe alcohol poisoning or a dozen other things they write down as the cause of a sudden death in a middle-aged man. In the early 70s, Thallium was an ingredient in rat poison, which was sold freely in hardware stores. No prescription, no signing a ledger. You walked in, paid 30 cents, and got a small bag of gray powder. Rat Death. That was the name of one brand. Faith bought her first bag in March of 1971 at the hardware store on Decker-Bristoff Street. The clerk didn't ask a thing. Everyone with a wooden house in this part of town was fighting a war against rats. Faith brought the bag home, poured some of the gray powder, fine as dust, onto a saucer. She cautiously touched the tip of her tongue to it. Nothing. No taste, no bitterness. Then she mixed it into a teaspoon of honey and tried again. It tasted like honey. Sweet, thick clover honey. She wrote in her notebook, "Poison. Cannot be tasted in honey. Dose, tip of a knife." This was the very same spiral-bound notebook with the puppy on the cover. The notebook that Sheriff Higgins would find 6 months later. The one that would make his fingers go cold. But that was still a long way off. For now, it was May of 1971. Youngstown was warm. Lilacs were blooming in the yards. The kids were out of school, running around until dark. The cafeteria at the mill smelled of chili and hamburger steak. Faith washed the plates. Greasy plates with dried-on mashed potatoes. The warm water smelled of soap. Faith scrubbed them with a rag, one after another, and thought. She thought about Rusty Gallulin. Rusty Gallulin, 38, a mechanic. He lived on the next street over, 2 houses down from Faith. His wife, Alfie, was 34. They had 2 kids. Rusty drank. He drank hard, binge drinking, blackout drunk. After payday, he'd disappear for 2 or 3 days and come back broke, with bruised knuckles, and he'd beat Alfie. She walked around with bruises, hiding her eyes, lying to the neighbors. I fell. I ran into a door. Everyone knew. Nobody did anything. Sheriff Higgins had been called out twice. Rusty would repent, make promises. A week later, it would all start again. Faith saw Alfie every day. She saw the bruises. She saw the frightened eyes of the children. She saw Alfie counting pennies at the grocery store because Rusty had drunk away his whole paycheck. And Faith thought, he lives, he drinks, he hits, he cheats, while her Ethan is in the ground. Ethan, who never once raised a hand to her, who dreamed of a son, who worked like 2 men. Where was the justice in that? Faith knew the answer. There was no justice. The government hadn't given it to her. The company hadn't helped. No one had helped, which meant she had to take justice into her own hands. On May 23rd, 1971, Zaytona Muhammadjanova died. She was 72, Alfie Galliulin's mother, Rusty's mother-in-law. She died quietly in her sleep, as one should at that age. The funeral was on the 25th. The wake was at the Galliulins' house. Alfie asked Faith to make an apple pie. Faith agreed. She spent the evening of May 24th baking. The crust made with lard, just like her grandma taught her. She rolled it thin, sliced the apples, simmered the syrup, honey, sugar, a little water. Thick, gooey, amber-colored. She took it off the heat, let it cool slightly. Then she took a small tin tea canister, the one with an elephant on it, and got out the gray powder. She sprinkled a knife tip's worth into the syrup. She paused, then added a little more. She stirred it in thoroughly, making sure it dissolved. She poured it over the apples, mixed it all together with her hands slowly, carefully, just like always. She arranged it in a glass pie dish, pressed it down, and let it set. The pie looked normal. It smelled normal. It was the same golden, sticky, honey-kissed pie. No difference at all. Faith opened her notebook. On a clean page, after a recipe, she wrote in her neat, careful hand, Galliulin, Rusty, May 25th. She closed the notebook and went to bed. The wake for Zaytona went as expected. The pastor said a prayer. The neighbors came, about 30 people. The table was set up in the living room, 2 tables pushed together, covered with a vinyl tablecloth. There was potato soup, fried chicken, green beans, pickles, bread, and the apple pie. Faith's pie sat in the center of the table, and everyone reached for it, cutting off slices, praising it. Rusty Galiulin sat in the corner, already drunk. His face was red, his eyes were cloudy, the collar of his shirt was unbuttoned. He ate the pie, washing it down with whiskey, talking loudly about his mother-in-law. She was a good woman. God rest her soul. Alfie sat next to him, silent. An old yellow bruise was fading on her cheekbone. Faith sat in the far corner. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. She watched. Rusty ate a lot of it, piece after piece, breaking off the crust with his sticky fingers, licking the honey. Faith counted. 3 slices, 5, 7. That's enough. The wake ended in the evening. Faith collected her empty pie dish, went home, washed it, put it on the shelf, and went to bed. 2 days later, on May 27th, Rusty Galiulin started feeling sick. Nausea, weakness, stomach cramps. Alfie figured he'd overdone it at the wake. It happened all the time. She gave him some activated charcoal. Rusty lay in bed, moaning and sweating. By evening, he was worse. The convulsions started. Alfie ran to a neighbor, who called an ambulance. It arrived 40 minutes later. The doctor, a young woman named Elena Viktorovna, 28, fresh out of medical school, examined Rusty. His blood pressure was low. His pulse was weak and thready. His pupils were dilated. It looked like acute heart failure or severe alcohol poisoning. The doctor asked, was he drinking? Alfie nodded. A lot. At a wake, they took Rusty to the hospital. He lost consciousness in the emergency room. 4 hours later, Rusty Galiulin was pronounced dead. The death certificate read, acute cardiovascular failure. He was 38 years old. They buried him 2 days later. Not many people came to the wake. Rusty hadn't been well liked. Alfie was composed, dry-eyed, no wailing, no theatrics. The neighbors noticed and whispered among themselves, she's not crying, but you can understand why. Faith didn't go to Rusty's wake. There was no reason. No one asked for a pie. She sat at home in her kitchen, drinking tea and looking at Ethan's photograph. One down. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel guilt. She felt what a housewife feels when she finishes cleaning one room and moves on to the next. A job. Just a job. Sheriff Higgins, for his part, noticed nothing. A 38-year-old man dies after a drinking binge. What was there to investigate? Deaths like that happen 3 or 4 times a year in his county. Booze, a bad heart, age. It was a routine matter. But Faith was already thinking about the next one. Nate Safiullin, 45, a bus driver on the number 12 route from Youngstown to Boardman. He lived on Tuya Street, a block over from Faith. His wife, Gwen, was 39. They had 3 kids. Nate drank. Not as hard as Rusty, but regularly. Every Friday, like clockwork. Payday meant a binge. A holiday meant a binge. A bad mood meant a binge. He beat his wife. Gwen had gone to the sheriff's office 3 times, filed a report. Twice, she dropped the charges. The 3rd time, it went to a hearing at his work. Nate was given a formal warning. He promised to change. He lasted a month, then it all started again. Faith knew Gwen. Not as a friend, but they'd say hello. Faith saw how Gwen wore a thin coat in the winter because Nate had pawned her warm one. She saw how their oldest son, 14, would wait by the gate in the evenings, waiting for his father to come home so his mother wouldn't get the worst of it. She saw Gwen at the grocery store, counting her change and putting a stick of butter back on the shelf because she was short. On June 28th, Hamid Zarapov died. He was 64, a neighbor of the Safiullins, an old man, a veteran, quiet. He'd been sick for a long time. The funeral was on the 30th. The wake was at the Zarapovs' house. Gwen Safiullin came to help. They'd been neighbors for 30 years. Faith was asked to make the pie. Hamid's widow, Razia, asked her personally. Faith, honey, please make it the way you do. Hamid loved your pie. Faith agreed. She baked it on the evening of the 29th. The same recipe, the same gray powder from the tin can, the same dose on the tip of a knife, maybe a little more. In her notebook, a new entry, Safulin, Nate, June 30th. At the wake, Nate Safulin sat next to the widow, offering his condolences, drinking vodka, shot after shot, and eating the apple pie. Faith saw him. He ate greedily, in big bites, shoving it into his mouth with his fingers. She sat in her corner and counted. On July 2nd, Nate felt sick. The same symptoms: nausea, vomiting, weakness, stomach pain. Gwen thought he had food poisoning. Maybe the vodka was bad. Maybe he'd eaten something that had gone off in the heat. She called an ambulance. It came. A different doctor, not the one who'd seen Rusty, looked him over and shook his head. Looks like food poisoning or a heart issue. He suggested taking him to the hospital. Nate refused. He hated hospitals. By the morning of July 3rd, he was much worse. Convulsions, loss of consciousness. Gwen called the ambulance again. This time, they took him. At the hospital, Nate Safulin died at 2:35 p.m. The diagnosis: acute food poisoning complicated by chronic alcoholism, heart failure. He was 45. Gwen cried at the funeral. Maybe out of habit, maybe for real. When you live with a man for 20 years, even if he hits you, you feel something. Maybe not love, maybe just habit, or relief, or both at once. Faith came to the funeral, stood off to the side in her black shawl, and said nothing. Done. A month passed between the second and third deaths. July in Youngstown was hot and muggy. The asphalt in the city center got soft. In Faith's neighborhood, there was no asphalt. The dirt roads were dusty, and the grit got in your teeth. Kids swam in the Mahoning River, even though the health department had forbidden it. The water was polluted from the mills. The men drank beer at the corner store. The old women sat on their porches, shelling peas and gossiping about the neighbors. 2 deaths in 2 months. Rusty Galiulin and Nate Safulin. The neighborhood whispered about it for a day, then forgot. Men died. It happened. Booze, the heat, nothing surprising. Sheriff Higgins wasn't surprised either. 2 cases weren't a pattern yet. It was just a statistic. A sad one, but a common one. Faith waited, patiently, the way a baker waits for dough to rise. The third opportunity came in August. Mike Zagadulin, 41, a loader at the wholesale market. He was big and broad-shouldered, with a red face and thick fingers. He lived on Gagarin Street, 5 houses down from Faith. His wife, Ramsia, 37, was thin and beaten down, with eyes that were always looking at the floor. Mike was a small-time crook. His official job was a loader, but his real income came from stolen goods. A sack of potatoes out the back door for a friend, a crate of tomatoes that never made it to the register. He had money, but he spent it on himself. Cheap port wine, cigarettes, and poker games in the evening with other loaders. Ramsia saw none of that money. She wore a hand-me-down coat. The kids wore clothes from neighbors. Mike didn't just hit Ramsia. He humiliated her in public. He could say in front of everyone, "You're an ugly mutt. You're lucky I married you. Who else would want you?" Ramsia would stay silent, lower her eyes, and walk away. On August 20th, Eunice Zagadulin died. He was Mike's cousin, 56 years old, a heart condition. He'd been in the hospital for a month, was discharged, and died a week later. The funeral was on the 22nd. The wake was at Mike's house. It was a big house, and there were a lot of people. Ramsia asked Faith to help with the food. Faith agreed, and of course, she brought an apple pie. At the wake, Mike drank vodka and told stories about Eunice, loudly, laughing and slapping his knee. Ramsia sat in a corner like a shadow. Faith sat across the table. She watched as Mike ate the pie, slice after slice, his sticky fingers wet with honey. In her notebook, the third entry: Zagadulin, Mike, August 22nd. On August 24th, Mike felt sick. Nausea, weakness, numbness in his legs. He blamed it on the heat and the vodka from the day before, drank some pickle juice, and lay down. By evening, he was worse. Ramzia wanted to call an ambulance. Mike yelled at her, "Don't you dare. It'll pass." It didn't. On the morning of August 25th, Ramzia woke up to silence. Mike was lying next to her, not breathing. The ambulance pronounced him dead. Diagnosis: acute heart failure. He was 41. 3 men, 3 deaths. May, July, August. 3 different houses, 3 different families, 3 different wakes. But one detail was the same. A detail that no one had yet noticed, except for Faith herself, who sat in her kitchen, drinking tea and looking at her notebook. 3 names, 3 dates. She turned the page. It was blank. There was still room. Fall, 1971. September in Youngstown was rainy and gray. The leaves on the poplar trees were yellow, wet, and heavy. A damp wind blew in from the river. In Faith's neighborhood, the mud was ankle deep. The women pulled rubber boots on over their shoes. The men wore work boots. The neighborhood lived its usual life. Rusty, Nate, and Mike were remembered, but without much grief. Men died. It happened. To be honest, their wives weren't exactly devastated. Alfie Galulin seemed calmer, her face brighter. She got a job at a sewing factory. Her kids were doing well in school. Gwen Sefiulin had come back to life too. She stopped hiding her eyes and started talking to the neighbors again. Ramzia Zagadulin had practically blossomed. For the first time in 10 years, she bought herself a new dress. No one connected these changes to Faith. No one thought about Faith at all. She was like a piece of furniture, a chair in the corner that no one notices until they need a place to sit. But at the end of September, something happened that Faith had not planned, something that changed everything. On September 24th, Qasim Ibragimov died at 69. He was the father of Vernon Ibragimov. He was an old man, a World War II veteran, decorated. He'd been sick for a long time, his lungs, from a wound he'd gotten during the war. He died at home, peacefully, surrounded by his family. The funeral was on the 26th. The wake was at the Ibragimov's house on Tuya Street. Vernon Ibragimov, 50, was a foreman at the Tepla Control Factory. A veteran himself, not of a war. He'd been too young, but a veteran of labor. 15 years at the same factory. Certificates, commendations. His picture was on the Employee of the Month board. His wife, Zura, was 47. They had 2 grown children, a son in the army and a daughter in college studying to be a teacher. Vernon didn't drink at all. As a matter of principle, he'd say, "God forbids it, and for good reason." He didn't smoke. He didn't hit his wife. On the contrary, the neighbors held him up as an example. Now, Vernon, there's a real man. Works hard, doesn't drink, provides for his family. If only they were all like that. Faith knew Vernon. Not well, but she knew of him. He lived 2 blocks away. His wife, Zura, sometimes bought an apple pie from Faith. Not for a wake, but just for the family. Faith liked Vernon. He was quiet, calm, respectful. He reminded her of Ethan. For the wake of Qasim Ibragimov, Zura called Faith. "Faith, dear, could you please make an apple pie? My father-in-law loved it so much. Let it be on the table for him one last time." Faith agreed. But this time, she didn't add the poison. She had no plans to kill Vernon. Vernon was a good man. He didn't drink. He didn't hit his wife. He didn't cheat. He was like Ethan. You didn't touch men like that. She made a regular apple pie, a clean one, without the powder. She brought it to the wake, set it on the table as usual, and sat in her corner as usual. But then, something she hadn't foreseen happened. Vernon Ibragimov ate the apple pie at his father's wake. He didn't eat much, a slice or two at most. He drank tea, not vodka. He was sober, quiet, and sad. A normal wake, normal food, a normal evening. And 2 days later, on September 28th, Vernon Ibragimov died. Zuhra called the ambulance in the morning. Vernon had woken up with a severe headache, weakness, and nausea. By noon, the convulsions started. He got worse at the hospital. By evening, he was dead. The diagnosis: acute heart failure. He was 50 years old. Faith found out about Vernon's death from a neighbor. She stood by her gate, listening. Her face was motionless, her dark eyes empty. She didn't understand. She hadn't added any poison. The pie was clean, she was sure of it. But Vernon had died in the same way, with the same symptoms. 2 days after a wake, Faith went home, took out the tin canister, opened it, and looked at the gray powder. She looked at the bag of flour sitting next to it on the shelf. Then she looked at the jar of honey, then at the wooden cutting board where she sliced the apples for her pies. And she understood the board. She had sliced the apples on the same board she'd used to measure out the powder. She had washed the board, but not well enough. Traces of thallium had remained in the wood, soaked into the cracks, and transferred to the apples. A microscopic dose, but for a 50-year-old man with a weak heart, it was enough. Faith sat down on a stool and sat there for a long time. Then she opened her notebook. On the page where the 3 names were written, she added a 4th, Ibragimov, Vernon, September 26th. But next to this name, she didn't put a period. She put a question mark. This was her mistake. Not the board, not the powder, but the name of Vernon Ibragimov in her notebook. Because it was his death, the death of a man who didn't drink, didn't hit his wife, didn't skip work, a man who, by Faith's logic, did not deserve to be punished. That broke the pattern and made one meticulous sheriff start to think. Sheriff Ray Higgins, 46, sheriff of this district in Youngstown, Ohio. He'd been on the job for 17 years. Before that, the war, drafted in 43 at 18, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, took shrapnel in his left leg. He still walked with a limp, a Purple Heart, and a Bronze Star. After the war, the police academy, then sheriff's deputy. He'd been married, divorced, no kids, lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment on Dekabristov Street, smoked Camels, drank moderately, a shot of whiskey with dinner, no more. Higgins was a difficult man. His superiors didn't like him because he asked questions. Where other deputies would check a box, close the file, and go home, Higgins would dig, poke around, and double-check. A habit from the war. If something doesn't look right, figure it out. The death of Rusty Galulin in May. Higgins had noted it. He wasn't surprised. A drunk, 38 years old, a heart gives out. It happens. The death of Nate Safulin in July, he noted that too, also not surprised. A drunk, 45. Heart or bad booze. It happens. The death of Mike Zagadulin in August. He noted it and paused. 3 men, 3 months, 3 deaths. All of them drinkers. All from heart failure or poisoning. All after a wake or a party. A coincidence? Probably. In this part of town, men died often. Booze, hard labor, no health care. It was just statistics. Higgins shrugged and put the papers in a folder. But then Vernon Ibragimov died. And that's when Higgins became suspicious. Because Vernon Ibragimov didn't fit. Vernon didn't drink at all. The whole neighborhood knew that. Vernon didn't smoke. Vernon worked, earned his paycheck, provided for his family, went to church. Vernon was healthy. Well, for a 50-year-old man. Sure, and he had high blood pressure sometimes, but not enough to kill him in 2 days. Higgins pulled out the folder and reread his notes. Galulin died 2 days after a wake. Safulin, 3 days after a wake. Zagadulin, 2 days after a wake. Ibragimov, 2 days after a wake. 4 deaths, 4 wakes, One pattern. Higgins lit a camel and tried to remember who had been at the Galiulans' wake. Neighbors, relatives, 30 people or so. Who was at the Zarapovs, where Safiullin died? Pretty much the same crowd. Who was at the Zagadulans? Also neighbors and family. And the Ibrahimovs? Higgins didn't take the easy way out. He took his notepad and walked the neighborhood. He asked questions carefully, not like an investigator, but like the local sheriff who's supposed to know what's going on. Were you at the wake? Who else was there? What did you eat? What did you drink? The answers formed a list. Higgins read the names. Many of them were repeated. It was a small neighborhood. Everyone knew everyone. The same neighbors went to the same wakes. But one name appeared on all 4 lists. Faith Nelson. Higgins remembered Faith, a quiet widow living on Gagarin Street. Bakes apple pies, a harmless, unassuming dishwasher. But she had been at all 4 wakes, and at all 4, so had her apple pie. Higgins thought for a moment and wrote in his notepad, Nelson. All 4 wakes. Apple pie. A coincidence? He put a question mark there out of habit, but his hand already knew the answer. On October 1st, 1971, Higgins went to see Alfie Galiulin, the widow of Rusty, the first victim. Alfie opened the door. She looked good. Calm, clean, no bruises. The house smelled of laundry, soap, and fried onions. The kids were doing their homework at the table. Higgins asked carefully about Rusty, about his last days, what he ate, what he drank, how he felt. Alfie looked at him for a long time, then said, Sheriff Higgins, I'm not crying for him, and you know why. He beat me for 8 years, but I want to know, was it really his heart? Higgins asked, Why do you ask? Alfie hesitated, then said, He was a strong man, healthy. Yeah, he drank, but to just drop dead like that, at 38, my father drank more than him. And he's 72, still alive. Higgins wrote it down, thanked her, and left. Then he went to see Gwen Safiullin, then Ramzia Zagidulin. He asked the same questions and got similar answers. Their husbands were healthy. They were drinkers, yes, but strong men. And they had died suddenly, after a wake. On October 3rd, Higgins went to see Zura Ibrahimova, Vernon's widow. Zura was crying, not like Alfie, not like Gwen, not like Ramzia. Zura was crying for real, a heavy, womanly grief that seemed to shake the walls. Vernon had been a good husband. She had loved him, and she couldn't understand how a healthy, non-drinking man of 50 could die of a heart attack in 2 days. Higgins asked what he had eaten at the wake. Zura listed the food: soup, noodles, meatloaf, potatoes, bread, and Faith's apple pie. The pie, Higgins asked. And what did he drink? Zura shook her head. Tea. Only tea. You know he didn't drink. Higgins nodded. He knew. He left Zura's house and lit a cigarette. He stood by the fence, looking at the gray sky, the wet poplar trees, the puddles reflecting the wooden houses, and he thought, 4 deaths, all after a wake. At every wake, there was an apple pie made by Faith Nelson. 3 of the men were drinkers. You could blame it on the booze. But the 4th was a teetotaler. You couldn't blame it on the booze. Higgins was a sheriff, not a homicide detective. He didn't have the authority to open a murder investigation, but he had the right and the duty to file a report. On October 4th, 1971, Sheriff Ray Higgins submitted a report to his supervisor, Major Gabdolin, at the Youngstown precinct. The report detailed 4 cases of death in men aged 38 to 50 between May and September 1971. All had occurred after a wake. The same woman had been present at all of them. Possible connection, he wrote. Major Gabdolin read the report and winced. He said, Higgins, are you serious? Some woman is a pie poisoner? These guys died from booze. Stop making things up. Higgins didn't back down. He insisted. He asked for an investigation, for at least one exhumation, for at least one toxicology analysis. Gabdillon waved him off. No grounds. There's a diagnosis, a death certificate. It's all official. Go do your job. Higgins left, but he wasn't satisfied. On October 5th, he drove to the local university. He found an acquaintance, Arkady Steinberg, a 60-year-old professor in the toxicology department. Higgins knew him from an old case. About 10 years back, there had been a poisoning at a factory. Steinberg had done the expert analysis. Higgins told him everything. 4 deaths, similar symptoms, the same food item on the table. Steinberg listened, then asked, what were the symptoms? Specifically, Higgins listed what he knew: nausea, vomiting, weakness, convulsions, loss of consciousness, death within 2 to 3 days. Steinberg took off his glasses, wiped them, and put them back on. Ray, he said, it could be anything. Alcohol poisoning, food poisoning, a heart attack. But there is one thing that produces exactly that clinical picture and is almost impossible to detect in a standard autopsy. What's that? Higgins asked. Thallium, Steinberg said. Thallium salts are an ingredient in some rat poisons. Tasteless, odorless, dissolves in any liquid, takes effect in a day or two. The symptoms are exactly what you described, and in a routine autopsy, they won't find it. You need a special analysis, one they don't even do in Youngstown. You'd have to send it to Cleveland or maybe even D. C. Higgins was quiet for a moment, then asked, if we exhume a body after 5 months, will the thallium still be there? Steinberg nodded. Thallium is stored in the bones and hair for years. If it was there, we'll find it. Higgins thanked him, left, and lit a Camel on the steps of the science building. His hands were shaking, and not from the cold. Now he had to get an exhumation order. And to do that, he had to convince people who didn't want to listen. On October 6th, Higgins went back to Gabdillon. With him was a handwritten note from Steinberg. Given the described symptoms, I recommend ruling out thallium salt poisoning through toxicological analysis of biological samples. Gabdillon read it and winced again. But a note from a professor wasn't just a sheriff's hunch. It was a document. Fine, Gabdillon said. I'll pass it up to the detectives. Let them decide. The case landed on the desk of Detective Oleg Sorokin of the Youngstown Homicide Division. Sorokin was 40, originally from New York, had been in Youngstown for 10 years. He was a homicide detective who handled major cases, a calm, methodical man. He read Higgins's report. He read Steinberg's note. He called Higgins in. They talked for an hour. Higgins laid it all out. 4 deaths, wakes, apple pie, faith. Sorokin listened without interrupting, then asked, motive? Higgins shrugged. I don't know. She's a quiet widow. Her husband was killed at the mill 3 years ago. She didn't get any compensation. That's all I know. Sorokin wrote it down, then said, I need an exhumation. At least 1 body. Ibrahimov's. He was a non-drinker, healthy. His death is unexplained. If we find thallium, we have a case. Getting an exhumation order in Ohio in 1971 was not a simple task. You needed a prosecutor's approval, a solid reason, and a boss who wasn't afraid of a scandal, because an exhumation meant noise. It meant the newspapers. It meant questions from upstairs. What's going on down there? Why didn't you prevent this? Sorokin wrote a request to the county prosecutor, attaching Higgins's report and Steinberg's note. The prosecutor, a cautious political man who didn't like taking risks, read the papers for 2 days, then called Sorokin in. Oleg, you understand that if we dig up a grave and find nothing, they'll have our heads, right? The Ibrahimov family is well respected. The father was a war hero. This will be a scandal. Sorokin replied calmly, I understand that, sir. But if we don't dig, and this woman kills someone else, they won't take our heads. They'll take our badges. And they'll be right to do so. The prosecutor thought for a moment and signed the order. On October 8th, 1971, The body of Vernon Ibragimov was exhumed from the cemetery on the east side of Youngstown. Zura Ibragimova had given her consent, reluctantly, with tears in her eyes, but she gave it. Higgins had explained it to her personally. Zura, I want to know the truth. And so do you. Let's find out. The samples, hair, fingernails, bone fragments were sent to a federal lab in Washington, D.C. They promised results in 10 days. For 10 days, Sorokin waited. Higgins waited. Faith didn't know anyone was waiting. She went on with her life as usual. She went to work at the cafeteria, washed dishes, came home, cooked, and sat in her kitchen, looking at Ethan's photograph. The notebook lay in a dresser drawer, under a stack of linens. 4 names, 4 dates. On October 16th, the results came back from Washington. Sorokin opened the envelope in his office, read it again, and put it on his desk. The conclusion: in the biological samples taken from the exhumed body of V. Ibragimov, thallium salts were detected in a concentration 2.3 times the lethal dose. Vernon Ibragimov had been poisoned. Sorokin picked up the phone and called Higgins. Ray, you were right. Thallium. Lethal dose. We're opening a case. On October 17th, 1971, the Youngstown Police Department opened a criminal investigation into the premeditated murder of Vernon Ibragimov. The charge: first-degree murder. Sorokin led the task force. Higgins was included as a consultant. He knew the neighborhood, the people, and Faith. But it was too soon to go to Faith directly. They needed more evidence, a link between the poison and a specific person. Sorokin started by getting exhumation orders for 2 more bodies, Galiulins and Safiulins. He couldn't get one for Zagadulin. Ramzia had left town to live with her sister and wasn't responding to letters. Without a relative's consent, the prosecutor refused. The results for Galiulin and Safiulin came back on October 26th. Thallium, in both bodies, in lethal doses. 3 poisonings, 3 murders, 1 pattern, wakes, 1 food item, apple pie, 1 person, Faith Nelson. But this still wasn't proof. It was circumstantial evidence. For a court, they needed more. They needed to find the poison in her house. They needed a motive. They needed a confession or irrefutable physical evidence. Sorokin made a decision: surveillance. He put Faith Nelson under covert surveillance and waited. Starting October 28th, 2 plainclothes officers took turns watching the house on Gagarin Street. One in a Ford Falcon parked across the street, the other on foot. Faith lived her normal life. To work in the morning, home in the evening. The store, home, all the kitchen. No suspicious contacts, but Higgins continued to work on his own. He questioned the neighbors again, carefully, without pressure, as part of his routine duties as sheriff. And one conversation paid off. Raisa, Faith's next-door neighbor, 63, an old widow who lived alone, kept chickens and a goat, and knew everything about everyone. A typical neighborhood grandma who sat by her window and saw everyone who came and went. Higgins dropped by her house, ostensibly on official business, to check the registration for her goat, a formality. While he was there, he asked about the neighbors, about Faith. Raisa perked up. Faith is a good girl, quiet, lives all alone, poor thing. A wonderful cook, her apple pie, to die for. Higgins nodded. Then he asked, as if it were an afterthought, does she have a rat problem in her house? Raisa frowned. Rats? I don't know. We all have them. These old wooden houses. How could you not? But I'll tell you something, Sheriff. She lowered her voice. Faith buys rat poison a lot. I saw her 3 times this summer at the hardware store on Dekabristov. I even said to her, Faith, what are you dealing with rats the size of cats? She just laughed and didn't say anything. Higgins remembered. 3 times over the summer. 3 purchases of poison, 3 poisonings, not counting Ibragimov. He passed the information to Sorokin. Sorokin had it checked out. He sent an officer to the hardware store. The clerk, a woman in her 50s, confirmed it. Yeah, a woman bought Rat Death 3 times. In March, June, and August. The description matched. Thin, wore a headscarf, dark eyes, quiet. There were no receipts. No one wrote down small purchases like that. The evidence was piling up. Circumstantial, but weighty. 3 purchases of poison, 3 poisonings. The dates matched. Sorokin decided, it's time. On November 3rd, early in the morning, a group of 4 men, Sorokin, Higgins, 2 detectives, and 2 civilian witnesses, approached the house at 14 Gagarin Street. Higgins stood by the gate, smoking a Camel. In his left hand was a search warrant, signed by the prosecutor. In his right, his notepad. It was a cold November morning. It smelled of rotting leaves and wood smoke. The neighbors were burning garden waste. Faith was home. She opened the door herself. She stood in the doorway, thin, not tall, in a dark headscarf and an apron dusted with flour. Her hands were covered in dough. She must have been baking. Sorokin showed her the warrant and explained calmly, Faith Nelson, we're going to conduct a search of your residence. Please step inside. Faith looked at Sorokin, at Higgins, at the detectives. She didn't say a word. She stepped aside and let them in. The house was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen. Clean, poor, tidy. The walls were covered in faded but clean floral wallpaper. On the wall was a photograph of a man in a white shirt. Ethan, young, with a gentle smile. A wedding photograph. In the kitchen, a table was covered with a vinyl cloth. On the table was a bowl of dough. Faith had indeed been baking. On the stove, a pot of syrup was simmering. On a shelf, a bag of flour, a jar of honey, a bottle of vegetable oil. The kitchen of an ordinary woman. They searched methodically. Sorokin directed. Higgins watched Faith. She sat on a stool in the corner of the kitchen, her hands in her lap, staring straight ahead. She wasn't nervous. She didn't cry. She didn't ask what was happening or what it was about. She just sat there, quiet as always. The first find. A tin tea canister with an elephant on it was on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, behind some bags of rice. Inside was a gray powder, about half a pound. Sorokin opened the canister, sniffed it, no smell, and showed it to Higgins. Higgins nodded. The canister was sealed as evidence, its contents sent for analysis. The second find, a cutting board, an old wooden one with cracks in it. Sorokin paid attention to it because Steinberg had warned him, thallium soaks into wood. Look for wooden surfaces. The board was also taken as evidence. The third find, the notebook. Higgins found it himself, in a dresser, under a stack of linens in the top drawer. A thin, spiral-bound notebook with a puppy on the cover. Higgins opened it. The first few pages were recipes. Apple pie, honey, 1 cup, flour, 3 cups, eggs, 6, vegetable oil for frying, meatloaf, biscuits and gravy. Ordinary recipes, written in a neat, almost childish hand. Then, a page that was different from the rest. Poison cannot be tasted in honey. Dose, tip of a knife. The next page, Galuolin, rusty, May 25th. Safuolin, Nate, June 30th. Zagadulin, Mike, August 22nd. Ibragimov, Vernon, September 26th. And next to that name was a question mark. Higgins read it. His fingers trembled. He'd been in the Battle of the Bulge. He'd seen men kill other men, but this was different. This was the neat handwriting of a quiet woman, listing the names of the dead between a recipe for apple pie and a recipe for meatloaf, as if she were making a menu, as if she were keeping a household ledger. He showed the notebook to Sorokin. Sorokin read it. His face didn't change. He never showed emotion. but the pause he took before he spoke was longer than usual. "Faith Nelson," Sorokin said, "without raising his voice, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder. Upon being charged, you will be provided with a lawyer. Do you understand what you are suspected of?" Faith looked at him. Dark, quiet eyes. No fear, no panic, no anger, nothing. She said one word, "Yes." Then she paused and added, "But not Vernon. That wasn't me. Not on purpose. It was the board. I didn't mean to." Sorokin wrote it down, word for word. Faith Nelson was taken from her home at 14 Gagarin Street in a locked sheriff's car. The neighbors saw it. Raisa stood by her fence, making the sign of the cross, even though she was a Baptist. Other neighbors whispered, "They took Faith." What for? What could she have done? No one believed it. Faith and murder. Quiet, modest Faith, who baked apple pies and washed dishes. Impossible. But the notebook lay on the detective's desk. 4 names, 4 dates, and a neat, almost childish handwriting. The interrogation of Faith Nelson took place at the Youngstown Police Headquarters. A detective's office, 2nd floor, window overlooking the courtyard, a desk, 2 chairs, a pitcher of water. The walls were painted a government-issue green. It smelled of tobacco and paper. Sorokin conducted the interrogation himself. Higgins was present, sitting in a corner, silent, listening. Faith sat in a chair, her hands in her lap, her back straight. Her headscarf had slipped slightly, revealing dark hair with premature streaks of gray. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look broken. She looked like a person who had been carrying a heavy sack for a long time and had finally set it down. Sorokin began with the formalities. Name, date of birth, address, place of work. Faith answered in a quiet, steady voice. Then Sorokin placed the notebook on the desk and opened it to the page with the names, Faith Nelson. "Is this your handwriting?" Faith looked at the notebook. "Yes." "What do these entries mean?" A pause, a second, 2, 3. "Those are the people I poisoned," Faith said. Her voice was steady. No emotion, no tears. As if she were reading a grocery list, Sorokin wrote it down. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." And Faith told him. She spoke for 3 hours. Sorokin didn't interrupt, just wrote. In the corner, Higgins broke 3 cigarettes without lighting them. Smoking wasn't allowed in the office. Faith told them everything. About Ethan, about the mill, about the press, about the committee that wrote, his own fault, about the 2 years of going from one office to another, about the letters that no one read, about the form replies that meant nothing, about the evenings in her kitchen, in front of her husband's photograph, about the silence, in which something slowly broke, about the men in the neighborhood, the drinkers, the abusers, the useless ones, about Alfie with her bruises, about Gwen counting pennies, about Ramsia with her downcast eyes, about how one day in the spring she realized justice will never come, not from anywhere, unless she took it herself. "I didn't want to kill just anyone," Faith said. "I chose the ones who drank, who beat their wives, who didn't work but just drank whiskey and ruined other people's lives. My Ethan worked every day, and he died, and they lived. Is that fair?" Sorokin asked. "And Ibragimov? He didn't drink. He didn't beat his wife. He worked. Why him?" Faith lowered her eyes for the first time during the interrogation. "Vernon was a mistake. I didn't want to. I didn't put poison in his pie. But the board, I sliced the apples on the same board where I'd measured the powder. I guess I didn't wash it well enough. I don't know. I didn't want to. He was a good man, like Ethan." She fell silent. Then she said quietly, "That's the only thing I regret." Sorokin wrote it all down. Word for word, the interrogation continued for another 2 hours. Sorokin clarified the details. Where did she buy the poison? At the hardware store on Dekabristov. How many times? 3. One bag at a time. How did she measure the dose? On the tip of a knife, a little extra. How did she mix it in? Into the syrup before pouring it over the apples? How did she choose her victims? She watched to see who was eating the pie at the wakes. How did she keep records in the notebook after each time? When asked why she wrote it down, Faith replied, "So I wouldn't forget, so I would know how many." When asked if she had planned to continue, Faith was silent for a moment, then said, "I don't know. Maybe, if I'd been asked to another wake." The interrogation transcript was 22 pages long. The investigation lasted 2 months, November and December of 1971. An analysis of the contents of the tin canister confirmed thallium sulfate, rat poison, Rat Death brand, the very same product that was sold freely in hardware stores. An analysis of the cutting board found traces of thallium in the cracks and wood fibers, confirming Faith's story about the accidental poisoning of Ibragimov. The toxicology analysis of the bodies of Galiulin and Safiullin showed lethal doses of thallium. No exhumation was performed for Zagadulin. The family refused consent, but Faith's testimony, the entry in her notebook, and the matching dates were enough to bring charges. A psychiatric evaluation was conducted at the state hospital. A panel of 3 doctors examined Faith for 3 weeks. The conclusion: sane. No signs of mental illness. Mild depression, withdrawn personality, but not psychosis, not schizophrenia, not delusional. Faith Nelson was fully aware of her actions and was in control of them. This finding shocked many. People had expected the experts to say she was sick, insane. Then it would all make sense, madness, illness. But no, Faith was sane. She had killed consciously, deliberately, methodically. During the investigation, Sorokin put together the full picture of events. 4 incidents, 3 premeditated murders. Galiulin, Safiullin, Zagadulin, 1 case of manslaughter. Ibragimov, the murder weapon, thallium sulfate, mixed into the honey syrup used to make apple pie. The delivery method, wakes, social gatherings, a traditional dessert. The motive, revenge for her husband's death, which had transformed into a hatred for men of a certain type. The indictment was 67 pages long. The trial took place in February of 1972. The Youngstown County Courthouse. The courtroom was small, held about 80 people. On the day of the trial, it was packed. The neighbors came. The victims' relatives came. A reporter from the Vindicator Times came, but the story was never published. The case was too uncomfortable. The judge was a stern, experienced man with a heavy gaze. The prosecutor was a sharp, dry man who spoke quickly and precisely. The defense attorney was a young woman appointed by the state, clearly overwhelmed by the scale of the case. Faith sat at the defendant's table in the same dark headscarf, thin, motionless, staring straight ahead. Not at the judge, not at the prosecutor, not at the gallery, at a single point on the wall. The prosecutor read the indictment. 3 counts of first-degree murder using a poisonous substance. 1 count of manslaughter. He cited the relevant section of the Ohio Revised Code, noting the aggravating circumstances, murder for base motives, and murder committed in a manner dangerous to many people. The witnesses were called. First, Alfie Galiulin. She entered the courtroom, quiet, pale, in a new dress. She looked at Faith. Faith didn't raise her eyes. Alfie testified, "My husband died on May 27th. Before that, we were at a wake. He ate the apple pie. 2 days later, weakness, convulsions, death. The doctor said it was his heart." The judge asked, "Did you suspect anything?" Alfie hesitated. "No." Rusty drank. "I thought it was the booze. But he was a strong man, 38 years old. I did think later it was too soon. Way too soon." Zura Ibragimova was called. She was crying, speaking through sobs. My Vernon didn't drink a drop. He was healthy. He shouldn't have died. He shouldn't have. The judge asked, "Did you know the defendant?" Zura nodded. "I knew her. A good woman." That's what everyone said. I asked her to make the pie myself. I asked her if I had known. She couldn't finish. She broke down crying and was led from the courtroom. Sheriff Higgins was called. He recounted how he had noticed the pattern, how he had conducted the interviews, how he had filed the report and pushed for an investigation. He spoke dryly, like a soldier. Facts, dates, names, no emotion. The judge asked, "What led you to suspect the defendant?" Higgins replied, "The death of Ibragimov. He didn't drink. He was a healthy man. His death couldn't be explained by ordinary causes. Everything else could have been a coincidence. But when you have 4 coincidences, it's not a coincidence anymore." Detective Sorokin was called. He laid out the course of the investigation, the results of the forensic analyses, the interrogation protocol. Methodical, calm, without unnecessary words, as always. The defense attorney tried to build a defense. She spoke of Faith's difficult life, the death of her husband, the 2 years of fruitless appeals to the authorities, the injustice that had broken a person. She asked the court to consider the mitigating circumstances. She argued that Faith was a victim of a system that had failed to protect her when she needed protection. She asked for leniency. The prosecutor, in his closing argument, was brief. "Your Honor, members of the jury, before you is a woman who, coolly and calculatingly, over a period of 5 months, poisoned 4 people. She exploited the trust of the people who invited her into their homes. She used a national tradition, the funeral wake, as a cover for murder. 3 of her 4 victims, yes, they were flawed men, drinkers. Crude, but being flawed is not a capital offense. No one gave the defendant the right to decide who should live and who should die. The 4th victim, Vernon Ibragimov, was a man of impeccable character. His death is a direct result of the defendant's criminal activities. I asked the court to impose the maximum penalty, death." The courtroom went silent. Someone in the back row sniffled. The judge turned to Faith. "The defendant will now make her final statement." Faith stood up slowly. She looked out at the gallery for the first time in the entire trial. She spoke quietly, so quietly that people in the back had to lean forward to hear. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I knew what I was doing. Rusty beat Alfie for 8 years. Nate beat Gwen. Mike beat Ramsia. No one stopped them. The police didn't stop them. The courts didn't stop them. The neighbors didn't stop them. So I stopped them." A pause. "But Vernon is my fault. My real fault. He was a good man, like my Ethan. I didn't mean to. If I could take it back, I would. But I can't. That's all." She sat down, lowered her eyes, and did not say another word. The jury went to deliberate. They were out for 4 hours. The courtroom waited. Silently, tensely, Alfie Galulin sat in the front row, wringing her hands. Zura Ibragimova was next to her, her eyes wet. Raisa, the neighbor, sat in the back, running her fingers over a rosary and whispering a prayer. The verdict was read at 5:30 p.m. The judge spoke slowly, clearly, looking out at the courtroom. The jury finds the defendant, Faith Nelson, guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. A pause. Considering the gravity of the crimes, the multiple offenses, the particular cruelty of the method used, and also taking into account the mitigating circumstances of the defendant's severe personal tragedy and the death of her husband under conditions not insured by his employer, another pause of this court sentences Faith Nelson to death. The courtroom let out a collective breath, not of joy, not of shock, but of something else heavy, dull, unspoken, as if everyone understood at once that there were no winners in this story, only losers. Faith listened to the verdict standing. Her face was motionless, her eyes dry. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn pale. She just nodded, as if she'd been told the weather forecast. The defense attorney filed an appeal. The Ohio Supreme Court reviewed the appeal in April of 1972. The verdict was upheld. Faith wrote a petition for clemency to the governor. The petition was reviewed. Clemency was denied. The sentence was carried out in the summer of 1972. Faith Nelson was 35 years old. The house at 14 Gagarin Street stood empty for 3 years. Then it was torn down along with the other wooden houses in the neighborhood. When new housing projects were built, a 9-story apartment building rose in its place, a standard, typical building like hundreds of others. Sheriff Ray Higgins continued to serve until 1978. He retired, lived alone in the same apartment on Decker-Bristoff Street. He smoked his Camels. In the evenings, he would walk in the park by the river. Sometimes he would walk past the place where Faith's house had stood. He would stop, stand for a minute, and then walk on. He died in 1985. He was 60 years old. Detective Oleg Sorokin received a commendation from the police department for solving the case. He continued to work in the Youngstown Homicide Division until 1983, then transferred to a larger city. He eventually made colonel. He rarely spoke of the Nelson case. When asked, he would say one thing: the hardest case of my career. Not because it was complicated, but because it was understandable. Alfie Galiulin remarried 4 years later to a quiet, non-drinking man, a mechanic from the Packard plant. Her children grew up. Alfie lived to an old age. She never spoke of Rusty, and she never spoke of Faith. Gwen Safiullin did not remarry. She raised her 3 children alone. Her oldest son graduated from the engineering program at the university. Gwen was proud of him. Ramzia Zagadulin left Youngstown to live with her sister in another city. Nothing more was ever heard of her. Zura Ibragimova had the hardest time of all. She had lost her husband, a good, beloved man who was guilty of nothing. She lost him not to illness, not to an accident, but to someone else's hatred, to a poison that wasn't even meant for him. An accident. A cutting board. Traces of powder in the cracks of the wood. Zura became a recluse, rarely leaving her house. Her daughter took her in. Zura lived for another 15 years. But the neighbors said that after Vernon's death, she never smiled again. Raisa, Faith's neighbor, outlived them all. She lived to be 91. Until the end of her life, she would tell the neighbors the story of Faith and the apple pie. Each time she would add, I told her, you know. I said, Faith, why do you need so much rat poison? And she just smiled. A final, chilling whisper, and that was the end of her smiling. What is this story about? It's not about poison or apple pie or wakes. It's about silence. The kind of silence in which a person breaks. Faith Nelson was not a monster. She was not insane. She was not a villain from a movie. She was an ordinary woman, quiet, hardworking, patient, the kind of woman who lived on every block in every working-class town. Her husband died, and no one was held accountable. She asked for justice, and no one listened. She knocked on doors, and every door was closed to her. And so, she found her own door, a terrible, irreversible one. This is not an excuse. Murder is murder. 4 people are dead, 4 families destroyed. Vernon Ibragimov, an innocent man, died because of a poorly washed cutting board. That can never be justified, not ever, but it can be understood, because Faith is the extreme example of what that silence leads to. The silence of a system that doesn't protect. The silence of neighbors who see bruises and look away. The silence of authorities who write no violation found and close the file. In silence, evil is born. A quiet, mundane, domestic evil. The kind that smells of honey and looks like apple pie. 4 men, 1 woman, 1 notebook. And the silence of a Youngstown neighborhood in which all of this became possible. Sheriff Higgins once said to Sorokin, after the trial, when they were sitting in his office drinking coffee, "You know what bothers me, Oleg? Not that she killed them. It's that for 3 years, nobody noticed a thing. For 3 years, she went to every office, asking for help, and every one of them blew her off. And then we act surprised when people take justice into their own hands. Sorokin remained silent, finished his coffee, and didn't reply. Sometimes, silence is the most honest answer. The Nelson case never made the major newspapers. It never became a big scandal. It didn't make it into the criminology textbooks. No books were written about it, no movies were made. It remained what it was, a local story, as quiet as Faith herself. But in that part of Youngstown, they remembered it. They remembered it for a long time. And whenever someone brought an apple pie to a wake, the old-timers would exchange a silent, knowing glance, because some stories don't need to be told. It's enough to remember them. If this story made you think, one click, and the next story will find you on its own.